Thank you, Michael, and hello, everybody. And I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules today to be here. Like I say, I'm Ed Cross. I'm president of the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association, or Cuyahoga as we're known. We're a state trade group for the oil and gas producers across Kansas. We have about 4,200 members across the entire state. And it's my privilege to be here today to talk about the American energy picture and some of the challenges and opportunities that face the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association. You know, the men and women who make up the Kansas oil and gas industry, theirs is truly a story of the American entrepreneur. They use daring talent, are dedicated to an idea even when the odds are great, and have the unshakable belief that in America all things are possible. And it's my honor and privilege to serve this great industry. I am a geologist by training, worked in the oil and gas industry now in different capacities for over 30 years. So whenever I look at when we talk about the independent oil and gas industry in Kansas, let me talk a little bit about who they are. The independents are the folks that drill and produce oil and natural gas here in Kansas. They're not integrated companies. They sell their products to purchasers. In the United States, independents drill 95% of the oil and gas wells in the United States. And in Kansas, we're responsible for 92% of the oil and 63% of the natural gas that is produced. A good way to look at an independent is they raise their capital through the wellhead. In other words, the cash flow that they get from the wells is the capital that they use to drill more wells or to get more production online. And they typically use resources to the fullest and therefore accelerate the process of creating value from their assets. They also know their backyard geology and production and how to get the most out of those oil and gas wells. So when you look at in Kansas, where's oil and gas at? And you know, we're in 89 of the 105 counties, but there are certain areas of Kansas that it's not in. As you can see in north central Kansas, even parts of northeast Kansas. But the average well in Kansas, whenever you look at that, even though you see it all over the entire state, and that, you know, the green area there is where our oil is, the red is natural gas, and the blue areas where oil and natural gas are produced. When you look at the average oil well in Kansas, we're about just under 2.5 barrels a day and 33,000 cubic feet of gas per day. You know, when I'm in Washington or even in Topeka and I tell policymakers about this that are not from Kansas, they're always amazed that you'd have such small wells, yet the industry supports 118,000 jobs and $3 billion in family income across the state. When you look at the value of the production in Kansas, 76% of the value is from oil production, 24% from natural gas. And so when you look at, I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics of the oil and gas industry and specifically about Kansas. And when you look at some of the oil and gas dynamics, you know, in the 1970s, many experts forecasted a permanent energy shortage in the United States. Many of you probably remember the embargoes, the gas lines. And even President Nixon came out with the plan to make our nation energy independent in 10 years. Based that on President Kennedy's 10-year plan to get a man on the moon in 10 years. And it happened to be easier to get a man on the moon than it did to get a nation energy independent. But if you fast forward, we see in the U.S. today we're a top producer, just this year, a top producer of both oil and natural gas in the world. And technological developments and efficiency gains has resulted in the U.S. oil production doubling since 2008. So that energy shortage has not come true, but in 2017, the U.S. is the top producer of oil and natural gas. Actually, we were top producer of natural gas since 2009. So when you look at U.S. oil production projected growth, we project that the oil production in the United States will go another 50% over the next decade. So today, over 10.6 million barrels of oil per day is produced in 2017, and that's expected to go to nearly 12 million barrels of oil per day by the year 2020. So the oil and gas industry projects that our nation will be energy independent by the year 2020. So I would contend that we did not have an energy shortage in the 1970s, but had a shortage of imagination and loss of confidence in our ability to innovate. So when you look at this energy renaissance, you know, over 20 new fields, I should say, have been found throughout the United States that has really added to this oil production to the United States, added $1.2 trillion to the U.S. GDP. But it has also created some global energy challenges that impact the Kansas oil and gas industry. And you can see, many of these fields are unconventional fields throughout the United States. We had part of the Mississippian Lime in south central Kansas, but most of them are large oil production fields throughout northern plains and down in Texas and in the Appalachian region. So if you look at crude oil market dynamics from 2015 through 2017, you saw a 75% drop in prices in 20 months beginning in mid-2014. Now, several drivers contributed to that fall, including the strong dollar at that time. Because the price elasticity of crude oil is low, real dollar appreciation serves to decrease crude oil prices. Many experts believe that the strong dollar contributed to about 16% of the fall in crude oil prices in 2015 and 2016. But the most significant factor contributing to that severe drop was the shock that OPEC nations, the oil-producing, exporting countries, created through their actions to regain market share at any cost. OPEC responded to this tremendous increase in the U.S. oil production by trying to dump low-cost oil onto the market to try to drive many U.S. oil and gas producers out of the market. They didn't do that. If you look back in December of 2015, another important factor is the U.S. lifted its ban on crude oil exports. And this greatly impacted the industry because now we could ship our oil products to other countries even for refining those products. In November of 2016, OPEC and non-OPEC agreed to remove 1.8 million barrels per day of oil off the market. We didn't really see a price rally in the first half of 2017 as a result of that because the output still exceeded demand worldwide. In November of 2017, OPEC and the partners agreed to persevere in those cuts through 2018 with the caveat that they would meet in June of 2018 to review that again. They did meet in 2018, and OPEC boosted its production by 1 million barrels per day, citing falling crude oil inventories and a tightening market. As the global economy, not only the U.S. but around the world, was growing, it was creating more demand, and they wanted to prevent the market from flipping from being supply-driven to demand-driven. So with that quick review of that, let's look at the impact of that price collapse on the oil and gas industry. And if you look at the price collapse, when you look at national level, companies cut their capex by about $61.2 billion in 2015 and another almost $90 billion in 2016, 250,000 direct layoffs, 1 million indirect layoffs nationwide, and over 100 American producers filed bankruptcy during that period. Whenever you look at the impact on the Kansas industry, Kansas companies cut their capex 75 to 80% in that period. So they were investing about $1.3 billion into Kansas in 2014, and now that's about $300 million. So it was a significant cut. Kansas lost $730 million in oil and gas output, and this affected more than just the producers. The royalty payments to those folks that own the royalty, landowners and others out there, that dropped by $400 million. We had 3,100 direct layoffs in the industry across the state of Kansas and 3,000 indirect layoffs to make over 6,000 people laid off in the state. Family income in the oil and gas industry, or in the state of Kansas, I should say, dropped by $341 million as a result of this price collapse. So when you look at the chart showing our oil and natural gas production, you'll see oil production dropped by 16.5% in 2016, dropped by 5.6% in 2017 before stabilizing this year in 2018. This is a lot of, we had a lot of unconventional development, what is horizontal wells in the Mississippian Lime in south central Kansas, that brought in a significant amount of oil production in the state of Kansas. As prices drop, those become uneconomic, and so many of that activity dropped. And so as a result of that, the production in Kansas dropped precipitously, as you can see on that red curve on the oil production. But now that the prices have stabilized, the conventional operations, which is what Kansas mostly is conventional operations. When I say conventional, I'm talking about vertical wells drilled into the earth. So now we're being able to keep up with the decline in the curves, and it's starting to stabilize. going forward. But that drop in price from 2014 through 2017 had a very negative impact on tax collections as well, both the state and local levels. Severance tax collections dropped by 58% during that time, and ad valorem tax collections to the counties dropped by 57%. Whenever you look at the number of permits and the rig count in Kansas, you had a 59% drop in permits to drill wells in Kansas. So, you know, this year, well, I should say in 2017, we had 1,500, a little over 1,500 drilling permits issued. When you look back in 2014, there was over 7,100 permits issued. So there was a lot of that. This year looks like there's going to be about a 25% increase in permits, up to almost 2,000 permits. We saw a 50% drop in rig counts during that time. You know, 2018 is showing a slight increase, 11% increase so far in the rig counts in Kansas. I think anywhere from 37 to 47 rigs running now, and when we did drop down to like 20 to 30 rigs, versus 2014 when we had 130 rigs running in the state. So natural gas production continues to fall in the state, as you know, there's lots of natural gas all around the United States, and many producers are trying to find markets to get those to. And I'll talk about some of the other impacts of natural gas here in just a minute. But if you look at the market dynamics this year and going into next year, you'll see experts out there that will project oil prices anywhere from $120 to $150, while others will say oil prices will going to fall back to $30 or $40. And I'll just pause right here, because I know I often get asked when I speak at different places, you know, where do you think oil prices are going to go? And let me just say up front, I don't know where they'll go. But it reminds me of a story of a consultant, not here to insult any consultants. There's no consultants in the crowd, right? Okay. But this consultant was driving down the road one day, and he came around this curve, and this farmer had this big flock of sheep crossing the road. So the consultant got out of his car or vehicle, and he went over to the farmer, and he said, "Boy, that's a large flock." And the farmer says, "Yeah, that's my largest flock." The consultant says, if I could tell you how many sheep are in this flock, would you give me one of those animals?" The farmer says, "Yeah, I could do that." He thought, this guy, there's no way he could do that. It's too large of a flock. So the consultant had all the gadgets. He had Google Earth, and he had his phone, and he had a GPS system, went back to his car and did all that, and came back to the farmer and said, "You have exactly 1,342 sheep in this flock." And that farmer says, "Well, that's exactly right. That's amazing." So the consultant says, "I'm going to take one of these animals." So he loaded the animal up, put it in his vehicle. The farmer said, "Well, before you leave, can I have a chance to win my animal back?" And he says, "Well, I guess you gave me a chance." He says, "What do you have in mind?" The farmer says, "If I can guess what you do for a living, will you give me my animal back?" And he said, he knew he hadn't told the farmer that he was a consultant. So he says, "Yeah, go ahead and take a guess. Take your time, and figure it out." And the farmer said, "No, I don't need any time. I know exactly what you are. You're a consultant." He goes, "Well, how did you know that?" "That's exactly right." And he says, "Well, you gave me 3 clues. One, first you came unannounced. Second, you told me something I already knew. And third, you really don't know anything about my business. Now give me back my dog." So I'm not here to project where I think oil prices will go, but what I have to do is the market is fraught with uncertainty, and there's a lot of price volatility. When you look at that, you look at Saudi Arabia. They have a spare capacity. Many believe they have about 1 million barrels per day of spare capacity, meaning they could produce that much more oil. Had the privilege recently to go visit with the National Economic Council in Washington, D.C., where they're worried that in November we're going to, put some sanctions on Iran. And are we going to be able to produce enough oil to overcome those sanctions? The data that we had in our group that we went there showed that the United States indeed can overcome that, the sanctions that would go on Iran. Venezuela's production, it's as we mentioned before, they're not maintaining their production. The production continues to go down. You still have Nigerian rebel risks to oil production. Commercial inventories are no longer in excess here. And so the National Economic Council is projecting, using economic models of growth nationwide, or globally, I should say, a 1.8 million barrel per day increase in demand each year going forward. So they want to know, can we make up for that too? And when we look at some of the projections, our group, we believe the United States could supply about half of that going forward. The rest of it would be from OECD countries and some of the spare capacity that Saudi Arabia has going forward. But we need a national energy policy that's going to support this energy policies that will help us produce some of this needed oil going forward. We provided 4 steps to the Economic Council. One is the pipeline infrastructure system for movement of oil and gas, including the Jones Act, as they call it, because it's hard for us to get even a natural gas. You can't load that on a ship in the Gulf and take it around to the East Coast. It has to be gone through pipelines. U.S.-China trade tensions are threatening natural gas exports. The Chinese tariffs, they've taken them off oil, so they're not on oil exports, but they still impose 25% tariff on LNG, liquefied natural gas. And so, that could weigh on natural gas prices in the long run, weigh down on those, I might add, in the long run. So, we look at streamlining permitting processes on federal lands, and while that's not a Kansas issue, that was part of what our group was talking about them. But what is a Kansas issue, and we'd lump these into large categories, would develop a stable regulatory environment by continuing to repeal and rescind crippling regulations that affect not only nationally, but also Kansas operations, and provide for a free market for all forms of energy. And so those are some basic categories. But the bottom line is that we have a high risk in a market and little spare capacity right now to cushion against any blows. So that's why you have a lot of experts predicting oil prices anywhere from $130 to $150 all the way down to $20 or $30 a barrel. So when you look at what are companies doing, I'm talking about what companies here in Kansas have been doing with this price collapse and what's going on now. They're refocusing their CapEx, becoming more specialized in their core producing assets here in Kansas. Many of the operators are high grading their drilling projects and only drilling the best prospects. Upstream costs in 2017, the drill and produce oil in Kansas in 2017 was on average about 25 to 30% less than what it was in 2012. And so, they've increased cost efficiencies and improved their productivity. There is a juxtaposition right now with Kansas producers between those that are aggressively adding core acreage to their development activity and working those wells, and those that are still dealing with leverage on their balance sheets and adhering to cash flow neutrality. So what Kansas is doing is basically recovering from that period when oil prices were really low. So the activity in Kansas is conservative and more muted than it is in other areas of the country. As I said, drilling permits are up 25% this year. Rigs are up 11%. And when you look at some of the key challenges and opportunities that we have going forward here, as you heard earlier, in the United States in general, not just oil and gas industries, there's more jobs in the U.S. than there are workers to fill them. And we heard that labor was a big factor in the agriculture sector, and it is in all sectors across the economy. It is in the oil and gas market as well. When prices fell from 2014, many companies were forced to modernize their businesses. And so companies here in Kansas and across the United States, they invested in new technologies and automation to manage some of these systems. And these changes made companies more efficient and boosted productivity. So in the coming years, these trends are likely to keep energy responsive to market conditions and more efficient than ever. But it's also transformed the labor needs for the oil and gas industry across the nation as well as here in Kansas. So that it does create new jobs, but the new jobs that it's creating is replacing ones that are rendered obsolete. So it's disruptive for many workers because the job that it's creating might not be able to be the same person who can fill that job as the one that lost the job before. So we need computer scientists to develop algorithms and things rather than pumpers or even roustabouts out there. So, this is something that even as an association we're looking at trying to help with a career center and providing even operators, not only career centers in the sense that we bring it out to schools and show them the different jobs, but also for operators and companies to show what is the value proposition for a young person wanting to get in industry. As we talked about the millennials, they oftentimes don't come to it doesn't entice them to know that you're going to work with a 5-year-old computer in a cubicle over here, and you might get an increase in pay if oil prices go up, but if you stay here for 40 years, you'll probably get a nice retirement. That maybe isn't the best way to attract the millennial crowd. He's looking more for flexibility and technology to work in all of that. So the impact on Kansas is that Kansas oil operations are likely to remain conventional, and they're small operations that will be tweaked by technology. Kansas, we usually, new technology comes into Kansas slower because we have small operators, and so we use whenever those technologies become more cost efficient, operators use those. Low-cost producers across the United States will establish a fair price for oil based on how low cost can go using technology. So this is what OPEC misjudged was in the United States, the ingenuity that we use to continue to reduce costs means that they can produce oil at even lower costs. So based on that, Kansas producers will be challenged to find cost efficiencies in this new oil market dynamic because the low-cost producers will be the ones that stay in business. When you talk about tariffs, that does impact our industry very much. One of the things that we talk about is steel tariffs. Oil country tubular goods, or the pipe that we use, is very affected tremendously. It's had a substantial impact on Kansas oil and gas operators who want to get that pipe. And one of the things that, and when I was in Washington, we talked to a number of policymakers, is it's not just that the price of steel is going up, but some of the quota deals that the administration has worked, like with South Korea, that says that we're going to put a quota of 70% on average of steel can be imported from South Korea based on the 2014 through 2017 years. Well, those were the years when oil industry were at the lowest. So oil country tubular goods, it's one thing for price of steel to go up, it's another thing for it not to even be available at all. Now, they assure us that the American steel mills is going to ramp up and be able to produce that for us, and we're hopeful that, and indeed, that will happen. When you look at regulatory reforms, one of the things that's interesting about that for our industry is we believe in that innovation is more important than regulation. And let me give you an example. A regulation, most of the time somebody will see a problem that needs to be solved out here, and we need to make regulation or something to go through that. Well, they have to introduce legislation, and it may have to go through that whole legislative process, which may be amended and all this, and go back. Then, and once it gets passed, it goes to the regulatory agency. They have to go through rulemaking, decide what kind of resources they need to be able to implement and enforce that. And it may be 3 to 4 years to get that whole process to solve this problem. Where industry, through technology and innovation, can oftentimes solve that problem in a matter of months. And so let me give you an example. And it just reminded me, because I saw Bob Brock with the Department of Transportation, but unmanned aerial systems, and he spoke at our convention here a couple of months ago. You can go out with those unmanned aerial systems and run even pipelines or flow lines or something that the industry has, and they can spot any type of problems before they become a major issue. That we can go out and fix those immediately, rather than saying, oh, well, that's a real problem, we need a new regulation on that, and we can go through the whole process of all of that. So industry can solve many of those with the technologies that are out there. I know we have some panelists that's going to talk about a number of different issues that are affecting them and their business, but public perception is another big challenge that we as an industry have, and we continue to work to try to talk about the importance of oil and gas to the quality of everyone's lives. And this is important because it's key to elements of business success, from either access to capital to regulatory stability, tax fairness, and more. One of the things that we've done is that we formed some strategic coalitions, and I just want to talk about about this. You know, we have state and national groups, but one of them that's very interesting is the one that we formed with the American Jewish community, with the Council of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, where we worked with the small independent oil and gas producers, onshore oil and gas producers in the United States, and the American Jewish community formed a 501c6 called the Council for Secure America. And we met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we was telling him all about this. And I asked Prime Minister Netanyahu if the increase in the American oil production, if that has made a difference for them in the Middle East. And you know, he said his words was it made all the difference in the world. And his final statement was, you know, for every time an American oil and gas well is plugged, it's like sticking a needle in my eye. And so that's the reason we formed this group, is so that we could get a message out about the importance of energy policy, so that we can become energy independent in the United States. I might add to this that, you know, from 2001 through 2017, this is some of the information that we brought, was the U.S. military spent $3 trillion in military spending in the Middle East alone. If we could become energy independent, that means the nation could maybe use $3 trillion for something else rather than military spending in the Middle East. So going forward, you know, when we look at that, we have a number of public information efforts, as you can see, that we do throughout the state. We have editorials as well as investigative reports. And when you look at what powers the United States today, you know, fossil fuels you know, continues to provide over 80% of our energy consumption in the United States today. When you look at what will power the world in the future, we'll see that by 2040, world energy demand is projected to be up 27%, and 77% of that energy consumption will be met by fossil fuels. And in the U.S., 60% of our energy needs will be met by oil and gas in the year 2040. So, in closing, I'd like to share with you a recent media inquiry that I addressed. A reporter asked me about the Kansas oil and gas industry story and what it was important to know about the oil and gas industry. And I told him that the industry is an exciting industry where innovation is always a constant. And I want people to know how hard the Kansas oil and gas industry works and how focused we are on performance and continuous improvement. You know, I'd say I've worked in the oil and gas industry for 30 years. I'm always amazed at how the industry never stops thinking about the next improvement, technology, or innovation that will improve our nation's energy security. But most importantly, I want people to know that the Kansas oil and gas industry isn't just working hard on what we have learned. We're working hard to improve on what we can do in the future. So with that, I would say thank you.